Hi, everyone. This is Carmen.
And Christina.
And this is Historias Unknown, a podcast where we talk about Latin American history. Sometimes it's horrible and deals with heavy topics like racism, corruption, and genocide.
But more than that, it's also about resistance, power, and community. And today's a very special episode.
Probably the most special.
I agree. We had the amazing opportunity to talk with Haley Cohen Gilliland, the author of the amazing, emotional,
powerful,
sad, but inspiring book, A Flower Traveled in My Blood, the incredible true story of the grandmothers who fought to find a stolen generation of children. Let me tell you about Haley Cohen Gilliland. She is a journalist and the director of the Yale Journalism Initiative. She's worked for The Economist. 4 of those years that she worked for The Economist were spent in Buenos Aires. And what she'll say in the interview, but again, this is where she first heard about Las Madres being in Argentina. What an experience, to first learn about them in country.
Yes.
She's got a ton of work published in the New York Times, National Geographic, Bloomberg Business Week, Vanity Fair. And yeah, A Flower Traveled in My Blood is her first book. Yeah.
Should I read the synopsis of the book real quick?
Yeah, read the synopsis of the book and then we'll just get into the interview.
In the early hours of March 24th, 1976, the streets of Buenos Aires rumbled with tanks as soldiers seized the presidential palace, overthrowing Argentina's leader. To many, it seemed like just another coup in a continent troubled by them, amid political violence and Cold War tensions. But there was something darker about this new regime. Quietly supported by the United States and much of Argentina itself, which was sick of constant bombings and gunfights, the junta quickly launched the National Reorganization Process, or El Proceso, a bland name masking their ruthless campaign to crush the political left and instill the country with Western Christian values. The dictatorship, which continued until 1983, decimated a generation. One of the military's most diabolical acts was the disappearance of hundreds of pregnant women. Patricia Rosenblit was among them, a mother and leftist revolutionary labeled as subversive and abducted while 8 months pregnant with her second child. Patricia gave birth in captivity, making one last call to her mother, Rosa, before vanishing. Her newborn son was also taken, one of the hundreds given to police, military families, and dictatorship supporters, while their biological parents were secretly executed and their bodies disposed of. For Rosa and the other mothers in her same situation, the loss was unimaginable. Their only solace was the hope that their grandchildren were still alive. United by this faith, a group of fierce grandmothers formed the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, dedicated to finding the stolen children and seeking justice from a nation that betrayed them. A Flower Traveled in My Blood is Rosa and the Abuelas' extraordinary story told by a journalist with unique access. With authority and compassion, Haley Cohen Gilliland brings this tale to life, tracing the lives of Patricia, Rosa, and her stolen grandson, Guillermo. As the Abuelas transform into detectives, they confront military officers, sift through government documents, assume alliances to see suspected grandchildren, and even pioneer a groundbreaking genetics test with an American scientist. A compelling mystery and deeply researched account of a pivotal era in world history, A Flower Traveled in My Blood takes readers on a journey of love, resilience, and redemption, revealing new truths about memory, identity, and family.
And yes.
And does it ever?
Yes, does it ever? So yeah, let's get into the interview here. We are here today with Haley Cohen Gilliland, the author of A Flower Traveled in My Blood. And before we get into any questions, I have to say, this feels like you wrote this for us because
specifically, yes.
Yeah, me and Carmen and our listeners. Because I was telling Carmen, well, and we've said this so many times, but anytime we talk about any history that's outside of because we're Mexican American, but also Salvadoran, but there was so much that we had to go and seek. And it wasn't until we started this podcast that we just didn't know happened, including Azucena Villaflor. Carmen did an episode about her. And then the book she read for our episode is in your sources as well.
I was so excited when I saw that. I was like, I read this too.
She sent me a screenshot.
That's amazing.
So yeah, it feels like you wrote this for us.
I'm so glad. I'm honored. Yeah, I did in part.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and excited to chat with you guys.
Yes, we have so many questions. I know we don't have a lot of time. And like I was just saying right now, we first came across the story of las Abuelas de la Plaza de Mayo and las Madres because Carmen did an episode on Azucena Villaflor. And it feels like we got so many comments, and ourselves, we kept saying this to each other, but like, how do we not know about this? And it's like, if you're not looking for this information, it doesn't seem like, unless you're in Argentina, maybe, it just doesn't seem like it's very well known. So how did you come across las Abuelas and las Madres and all of this?
Well, I would say that premise was exactly what motivated me to write the book. This idea of, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that these events happened, that they happened so recently, and that I had no idea about them. But to backtrack, the way that I learned this story was I moved to Argentina in 2011, at first on a research fellowship that then morphed into working as a foreign correspondent for 4 years in Argentina. And I moved down with a little bit of a background knowledge in the dictatorship. I knew the basic outlines of what had happened, that the military had disappeared tens of thousands of Argentines for having leftist beliefs. But I had never heard that among the people disappeared by the regime were hundreds of pregnant women, and that their babies had been stolen from them, and then those women had been quietly killed or disappeared, as I'm sure your listeners are familiar with. Argentina turned that into a transitive verb. And these babies were oftentimes placed with military and police families to be raised under false identities. And I became completely obsessed with the Abuelas de Plaza Mayo, who were this incredible group of grandmothers that banded together to find those stolen babies, their grandchildren. And, I lived in Argentina for 4 years, and I got lulled into the sense that everybody already knew this story. So while I was living there, it didn't occur to me to write this book. And then I came back to the United States, and the story had stayed with me. And actually, when I got pregnant myself for the first time, it came flooding back in a really visceral way. And I started talking to friends about it. And I was shocked. I mean, I studied history in college. Many of my friends did. And most of them had no idea that this had happened. And so that's a little bit of the backstory of both how I learned this story and why I ultimately felt so determined to write this book.
Yeah, because I think other than your book, there's like maybe one other in English, and that's it about them. And it's crazy.
Yeah, so that was shocking to me. The other book in English is a book called Searching for Life by Rita Arditi, and it's wonderful. She was an Argentine academic that then worked in the States for many years, and I owe so much to her because she actually donated, her life partner, Estelle, Rita died of cancer, sadly, many years ago, and her partner Estelle donated all of her interviews with the Abuelas. So by the time I started working on this project, it was 2021, and many of the Abuelas had passed away. But I had this treasure trove of archival interviews that Rita had done and Estelle had donated to be available to all researchers. So, I kind of, this book was written very much, I don't want to say on the shoulders, because I don't know if you can be written on the shoulders of
right.
I'm so grateful to Rita for writing that book and for the research that she did and put into it. But yeah, it's the only other book in English about the Abuelas.
And there's so many madres and abuelas that you could have focused on. And it's such a long, encompassing story as well. Also, we thought it was amazing how you were able to meet and speak to Rosa. How did you decide to focus on her?
Yeah, as you said, I mean, all of the Abuelas are absolutely incredible. And I could have written an entire book about each and every one of them. So figuring out where to focus was probably the greatest challenge. But I did feel very committed to the idea that the story be framed through the experience of one family, because even though the events in this book are, for many of us, thank goodness, very hard to relate to, everyone can relate to being a part of a family. And I felt that the closer I could get to one family's experience, the more the reader would be able to really understand and immerse in the historical events, really connect with what had happened. And from the beginning of my research, I just was blown away by Rosa. She is such a maverick. She's hilarious. She's brutally honest in the best way. She was a first-generation Argentine. Her parents had emigrated to Argentina to escape the pogroms. They were Jews from Eastern Europe. And they had become kind of successful ranchers, but Rosa had always had grand ambitions of living in a city. And so she trained to become an obstetrician at the very young age of 15.
I was so
crazy.
surprised at that.
Yeah. And, even at a time when Argentine women generally did not work after getting married if they were able to stop working. They were, middle class, upper middle class. She continued working as an obstetrician even after she got married to her husband, and they had their first and only daughter, Patricia. And Patricia was their only child, as I mentioned, and they really poured everything into her. They got her every type of lesson imaginable: ping pong, swimming, art. And they sent her to kind of Jewish school on the weekends. And in 1978, Patricia, their only child, was abducted by the military as part of this much larger purge of people that the military had deemed subversive. And this was I put that in quotes, this is a very, very wide definition of what a subversive person was. But Rosa, immediately threw herself into trying to find Patricia and her unborn grandchild, because Patricia was 8 months pregnant at the time. And after a month or so was connected with the Abuelas and was a central figure in the Abuelas movement for decades. She just retired a couple of years ago at the age of 102.
I was shocked.
Yeah.
About to turn 106 in a couple of days. I don't know.
That's crazy.
Staring, but she is still alive. And she just, she's spunky. She's plucky. She doesn't mince words. And, I think as a storyteller of nonfiction, the fact that she is so committed to the truth was very appealing.
And that quote of hers where she says throughout her testimonies, and even when she was talking to you, where she's like, I've never, I always say the truth. That's a perfect person really to have been the main subject of your book.
Yeah, absolutely. And she fought for truth has fought for truth for decades. But yeah, I think my favorite quote of hers, and I end I believe it was the author's note, but I end one of the sections with this. But she said during our interview, I always tell my story exactly as it is, the truth before everything. And for me, that really set the tone for the project, because having read the book, you understand there are some episodes in the book that are much more difficult to write about, and not everything works out in a way that can be tied up in a tidy bow. But her commitment to the truth and to telling the hard parts as well as, the triumphs, I think was really, really empowering for me.
And in a way, that makes her and her family even better subjects for the book than a happy reunion story, because the truth was that it was so complicated for so many of the children that were later found. And it wasn't all for the people that it was beautiful, but that's just not the reality. And so seeing the struggle, especially with Guillermo and his sister, and just seeing, and then there's other people, but just how hard that is for them. It was, again, so emotional to read.
Yeah. I mean, I think it felt very important for me to focus on one of the more complicated cases, because as you alluded to, there were some Cinderella stories, some instances in which grandmothers found their grandchildren and immediately they became incredibly close. They were calling each other on the phone every day. They were blending their families where, the adoptive family that had raised the child accepted the biological family and vice versa. And everything was, beautiful from the start. But I think, this is a story about a crime committed by the state. And that crime has reverberated throughout generations, and it has effects that continue to today. And I think it was really important to do justice to that, but also to show that, and this was one of the most surprising things to me, there are so many very fraught cases like Guillermo's where grandchildren did not necessarily want to be found, struggled with their new identities when they were found. But ultimately, almost all of them end up coming around and accepting their biological family and embracing the Abuelas and the Abuelas movement. So there's this idea of the truth as an invincible force that ultimately wins. It's like, like water. You can't, you can't resist it forever, and ultimately it prevails. So I think, focusing on a case that did have complications was very important to me.
It made it for like a whole better balance and picture of everything. It also reminds me of, and we wrote these questions down. I'm like, we're not even looking at them. But we did another episode, Carmen did, on Guatemala and what was Chile, right?
Chile.
They both had very similar cases during the dictatorship where children were taken. But it was different because they were sent out to other countries. Like, what was the one in Chile where a lot of them ended up like somewhere in Europe?
It was somewhere in Europe. I don't remember where anymore.
So that was very, very different in the case of Argentina, where they ended up with the very people that were doing these crimes against the parents. And that was mind blowing.
I know, it's wild. A really amazing book about the Guatemalan situation was Until I Find You by Rachel Nolan. I don't know if you've read it or had her on, but I'm
going to write that down.
Yeah,
I know immediately.
It's a wonderful book. I think it was a Pulitzer finalist either this year or last year, richly deserved. But yeah, I mean, I think the Argentine military was very intertwined with the Argentine Catholic Church. And
that was another crazy thing to read. We were screenshotting and texting each other the whole time, and we were like, "Look at this!" We were like, "That's crazy."
Yeah. So at least in Argentina, there was a sense among the military that they were doing something noble by stealing these babies, because in their view, they were severing the babies from their quote unquote subversive families and bringing them up with the correct Argentine values. And so there was almost a religious undertone to it. And that was the justification.
That reminds me of, I think it was Videla when he was testifying. I don't remember if it was him or another high official, but they said something like, to justify everything they did, they were like, well, God was on my side or something like that. And I was just like...
I think he said, Dios nunca me soltó la mano. God never let go of my hand. Yeah, absolutely wild. And Videla was incredible.
I was so mad.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
It's so, I mean, this is so dark and horrible, but like the Latin American dictatorship, like it was almost every Latin American country during this time period had very similar things happening. But it's so interesting to see the role of the church in each of these countries, because like Chile, it was very similar, where the Catholic Church was very much behind Pinochet. But then you have other places like El Salvador, where they had this growth of liberation theology, and then like Oscar Romero and what happened to him, and the Catholic like nuns and being targeted. So it's so, I don't want to say interesting because it feels wrong, but it's like, it's strange to see these very similar situations where right-wing dictatorships get into power, but then how they happen differently in all these places. But a lot of them have all these scary similarities.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was, once again, as you said, it's not interesting because it's too horrible to be interesting. But,
yeah.
A rabbit hole that I definitely went down when researching this book, because, for instance, in Brazil, the military was initially supported by the Catholic Church, but then the Catholic Church was a huge supporter of human rights organizations that sprouted in opposition to the military and tried to, uncover the crimes of the military there, and why that happened in certain places and not other countries is, something that's
something interesting.
Horrible. Yeah. Yeah. It is ripe for exploration and research.
Yes, yes. Another thing we kept doing when we were reading was like, oh, Operation Condor mentioned, because we did like 5 episodes on Chile and Salvador Allende.
Yes.
And then like just a bunch of little things that have been coming up in other countries. We're like, oh, this got mentioned, this got mentioned. So that was not fun, but interesting.
I know when I saw you, your most recent episode was about the Chicago boys. And that was interesting to me because Javier Milei, who's the current president of Argentina.
We wanted to bring this up. Yes.
Yeah. Maybe we save that for later. But, he has a dog a cloned dog named after Milton Friedman. So.
Yeah, when Carmen got to that part, she texted me and she was like, guess who his favorite economist was? And immediately I was like, Milton Friedman.
Ding, ding, ding.
Oh, yeah. We have this bingo card where we write things like the CIA is there. Like, what else is there? A coup happened. And like, we need to add Operation Condor to that bingo card. And like, we could have easily filled out this bingo card while reading this book. It was insane to me.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But we did have actual questions. Let me go back to our document.
I love it.
We have noticed within our own family history with El Salvador and the civil war there, that there's this urge to move on, to forget the past and focus on the future. How does the release of your book challenge this sentiment? Because it's very much not forgetting the past.
Right. And I think I can't take credit for that mission because I just wrote about a group of incredibly dogged and relentless women for whom that was the core of their mission. So the Abuelas and Madres are responsible for the main principles that they highlight as underpinning their missions are truth, justice, and memory. And, truth because the military tried to obscure and twist the crimes that it committed. Memory because the military disappeared tens of thousands of people, and only through memory can those people be honored? Because in the case of the grand majority, the location of their remains is unknown. Their families don't have a place to mourn or grieve. They don't know how they died. They don't know why. They don't know when. And so it's really through memory that those people can, both their families and the victims of the dictatorship can strive for some sort of peace. And then justice, of course. Argentina, as you mentioned, has swung, like El Salvador, between these dueling impulses of fighting for justice and this idea that in order for the country to heal and move forward, the country has to ignore the past and pardon the criminals that committed crimes during the dictatorship in the name of quote unquote national reconciliation. And the Abuelas in particular fought vehemently against this and found all these loopholes that allowed dictatorship era criminals to be prosecuted even when there were all these impunity laws shielding them. And they are responsible for the fact that Videla ultimately died in prison in 2013 because they won a case that showed that he masterminded and oversaw a campaign of systematic baby theft. So, I think the Abuelas and Madres are the ones who have really, pioneered, made sure that truth, memory, and justice remain kind of central to Argentine culture. And even as there's a president in office that is currently pushing against that and has clashed really fiercely with the Abuelas and Madres, that those tenets stay alive and are not vanquished.
And the case with Argentina, it's so rare because, like, again, dictators in Latin America, a lot of them who went to the School of Americas, the dozens, right? And like so few of them actually face any semblance of justice. And so for that to have happened with Videla and for these amazing strong women who I mean, like, who wants to dedicate their life to this? I don't think anyone is seeking to become like an activist. They were it was forced on them. And then after that, they really had like no choice, I feel. Because I feel like a lot of people think, well, like, how did they keep going? But like, they had to. Yeah. It was like, and it just makes me, it makes me think of, and this makes me so sad, but it makes me think of like today, where in El Salvador, there's mothers looking for their kids in the prisons right now. In Mexico, there's mothers looking for their children who were either subject to, the cartel violence or state violence, one or the other. So it's like none of these people ever want to do these things. So like they were forced to do it, and they did it. I don't know. They did it. So I'm going to cry. It was, again, such an amazing, important book. Like, oh my God.
And that's why, when I first learned about Azucena and Las Madres and Las Abuelas, I was not surprised to see that women, mothers, and grandmothers were at the forefront of this fight for justice, because that's the case, I think, often.
I was very struck by that, because it raised the question for me of where were the men? I mean, surely the fathers and grandfathers were every bit as distraught about the shattering of their families. But there were a couple of explanations that the Abuelas themselves offer for why the Madres movement and the Abuelas movement were so dominated by women. And I'll go from kind of most practical to most emotional. But one of the practical explanations was that, Argentina in the 1970s was still a traditional society that was governed by traditional gender roles. And so the men had to keep working, and many of the women were not working. They were focused on their families. And so they took up the mantle of searching, for their families, and that became their full-time job. The second reason, which I found fascinating, was, the Abuelas recognized that as middle-aged and elderly women, as grandmothers, they were going to be overlooked and underestimated, and they really used that to their advantage, and they leaned into that perception. So they would do these surreptitious meetings at cafes, and they would bring knitting needles live beside their coffee cups.
I love their sneakiness.
Yeah, their sneakiness. And they were, they could do really risky detective work and smuggle sensitive documents back into the country, crumpled up into chocolate wrappers, because nobody in the security checkpoint lines was going to look at them too closely. They were neatly dressed grandmothers. And they realized that their husbands and sons, might be more obvious targets for the regime, and it might be riskier for them to do some of those things. The last one is the most emotional. And there were several Abuelas that basically said, there's something, and now I'm probably going to cry, but like there's something about being a mom. And there's something, like, they talked about how some of their husbands, when their children were taken, kind of crumbled and like couldn't cope. And some of them died. Their wives said basically like they had died of heartbreak, but they just like couldn't go on. And for the Abuelas, that pain kind of transformed and calcified into determination to find out what happened to their children and to find their grandchildren. And it was, as you said, like they had to. It was a compulsion. There was something primal that they could not fight. And, I think that was a big part of why it was mothers and grandmothers. I think there's just something completely fierce and special about a maternal relationship. Not that there isn't about a paternal too, but in the Abuela's own words, it was a different force that kind of drove them forward.
Oh, yes. It reminds me of like I forget the day. Is it the 1st of May? There's a day in like Latin America where women go out in March, and these are almost all women, and you can find the singular man usually in the crowd, and they're always embraced by the women. But there's a reason, I think, not to discount like men and like where are the men, because again, I think a lot of the same reasons probably still apply to women today in these marches too. But it's so, I don't know, wild to see like the similarities between all these like struggles that continue sadly today.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish that this were, only history, but as we know, there are lots of common resonances in today's world.
Yeah, and it was very unfortunate to read about Millet and him trying to rewrite history, basically, and trying to say, no, the military also suffered, and we need to talk about the wrongdoing to the military. I was like, excuse me?
Yeah. I mean, so since Millet has taken office in the fall of 2023, he has clashed just constantly with the Abuelas and other human rights groups over these this campaign of historical revisionism, and also of just massive spending cuts that have affected the Abuelas. And so some of the organizations, there were some government bodies that supported the grandmother's work, and those have been either cut or, really downsized in a way that's very painful. And then there's an institution that really underpins the grandmother's mission called the Banco Nacional de Datos Genéticos. It's a national genetics bank where since the late 1980s, the grandmothers have stored their genetic data so that even if they passed away, their biological families might still be connected to their grandchildren. And that is now also under threat in Malay's Argentina. So it's a very tense time, but the Abuelas have never backed down from a fight. So
God, what an amazing group of women. And also Dr. King. I wanted to quickly mention that they found such a champion for their cause. Like that was like the perfect person to have been connected to them. And just reading about her too, I also cried. Again, a lot of crying.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, she is absolutely incredible. She is iconic and, at this point, world famous for having discovered the BRCA1 gene, but she was just such a perfect person to work on this project. She had a history of human rights activism. She had been involved in anti-Vietnam War protests. She had lived in Chile during the 1973.
I was shocked.
Yeah. And so she had experienced up close the effects of dictatorship, and she knew, the horrible impact that can have on a place. And then lastly, her daughter was the exact same age as the grandchildren that the Abuelas were seeking. And so she did not waver for a moment when asked if she would work on this project for the Abuelas, despite having a very, very full work life and family life, as you can imagine. But it really was just the perfect alchemy. And together they pioneered new forms of genetic testing. And I say this in the end of the book, but they really are responsible for pioneering genetic genealogy, which is the combination of drawing traditional genealogical methods like drawing family trees and then genetic testing. And that's a technique that's now widely used by law enforcement agencies. So that was how the Golden State Killer was convicted. And that all traces back to the Abuelas and Mary Claire King.
Wild.
Amazing.
Yes.
Yeah, I was really honored to get to know Dr. King. I spent a lot of time with her for this project, and she also just is, and I hope this came across on the page, but she has boundless energy. She's now, I think, 78, but just we would have these marathon interviews. I think the longest one we had was 9 hours.
Wow.
I read that. Yeah, I was like, oh my God.
Collapse into a puddle of, exhaustion. And I swear she was ready to, keep talking for another 12 hours. She's truly incredible. So I feel honored to have gotten to learn from her.
Amazing. It did come across. I love that she whenever a request from the Abuelas would come in, once they had their system going, they set everything aside, and her team was fighting to who was working on it. And that's just, I don't know, that's not only was she a champion for them, but you could tell that she fostered that within the people that were in her own team, for them to be as busy as they were, to just drop everything, no, I want to do this. No, I want to do this. That's amazing. Amazing.
It was. And I got to talk to several of I never know the correct scientific term, but I guess they were doctoral students who had worked with her on this project. And a couple of them got very emotional remembering their work on this project.
I'm sure.
Because they were so proud. So yes, it was wonderful to get to talk to them and reconstruct some of that. I also loved seeing the Abuelas faxes to Dr. King, because the Abuelas had this way of communicating that did not let people off the hook even a little bit. So it was like they would frame things as like, we'll expect to get your response, as soon as possible. And there are all these
you don't
other
have
cases.
an option.
Anyone an option. But they were lovely little grandmothers, so nobody could begrudge them. But I loved it. They were not going to take no or maybe or in a little bit as answers from anyone, even world-renowned geneticists who were helping cure cancer. So. Or not cure cancer, but learn about cancer.
Right. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, we're nearing the end here. One last question we had here. Something that really stood out was the theme of identity and the differences between how the Abuelas thought of identity versus their own critics. And one question you wrote about was, to whom does identity belong, whether it's the sole property of an individual or if the family and society have a right to truth. Can you talk about how the Abuelas handled these kinds of questions and criticisms over their work?
Yes. So that was a really thorny question and a very existential one. But essentially, the Abuelas always pushed for compulsory DNA testing. And this became more relevant, especially once the people that they were looking for became legal adults who could make their own decisions about whether to seek genetic testing or not. And ultimately, they made progress on having compulsory DNA testing passed into law. But the optics were sometimes quite difficult for them because the courts, if a person resisted coming in and giving blood, could order these raids in which a person's personal belongings like toothbrushes or hairbrushes could be taken from them for testing. And there were a couple of high profile instances of this. In one case, two people who were the adoptive children of a very high profile and rich and famous media mogul, whom the Abuelas believed were actually the children of desaparecidos, were caught up in this high-speed, very dramatic, very mediatic raid at this media mogul's mansion outside of Buenos Aires. And, there were a lot of people, including some allies of the Abuelas, who argued that you can't violate someone's human rights in the name of human rights. Mm-hmm. And the Abuelas argued back, a crime is a crime, whether it was committed yesterday or 30 or 40 years ago, and the state is duty-bound to investigate crimes. And in this case, especially a crime in which something as big as someone's identity has been stolen. And these tensions kind of continue to play out, but they were especially heated around a couple of these particular cases where there was resistance on the part of the suspected grandchildren. And I went into one case that ended up in the same way that Guillermo's case did, with the grandchild ultimately coming around to his identity. But
is this Ezekiel?
Ezekiel.
Oh my God. His journey. What a emotional ride to go through reading his journey. It really was. Him replacing the toothbrush in case there was a raid. But then ultimately in the end coming around, because in the end, I think it's a human desire to figure out where you're really from, who you really came from. And in the end, that was beautiful that he came around. And like you said in the book, the majority did come around, even if it took decades. And then his grandmother eventually, not even saying oh, I don't even she didn't fault him for taking so long to come around. Just that he came around in the end. I was crying again.
Yeah,
in tears.
He describes his grandmother, who unfortunately has passed away, but as a being that is as close to an angel as you can possibly come. she really did not begrudge him. He fought for 10 years against the Estes. So, they could have had 10 years to get to know each other.
Yeah.
That he resisted, and she didn't resent him for it or hold it against him. And she just was grateful for the...
Is she the one who was comforting his adoptive mother?
Yes.
I was like, she had to be an angel of a person, because wow.
Absolutely.
I can't.
Yes. Right. And especially, Ezekiel came from a family he was taken by a family that did have direct ties to the dictatorship. And his appropriative father actually, went on the run for 20 years and was trying to evade justice for 20 years. But he was an intelligence officer in the Air Force. And so, there were situations where the Abuelas grandchildren were adopted by families who didn't know the origins of the children that they were raising, but this was not one of those cases. So the fact that Nellie embraced, Ezekiel's appropriative mother, like that takes on new power of forgiveness and compassion.
Yes. But yeah, we don't want to take up too much of your time. So that was, I think, the last question that we had on our file. But is there, I think our readers are just like, this book was made for them.
I think they will eat this up.
They will. They really will. But in case there's anyone listening that, like, for some reason needs to be convinced, I don't know why, like, for some reason needs to be convinced to read your book, what would you tell them?
I think that I was so fascinated by this history. And I think your readers and listeners are clearly people who have a natural interest in Latin American history, in obscure areas of Latin American history. But it also felt very important to me because this is such difficult subject matter, and because the book really covers such a wide swath of time, I would say 50, 60 years. It was very important for me to write this in a narrative way that reads almost like a novel. Everything,
it really does, yeah.
As you've seen, because you looked at the source notes, but everything is documented. Everything is fact-checked. I was really, privileged to get to work with multiple fact-checkers. I have a background in fact-checking. If there are multiple stories that didn't add up, like I mentioned that in the endnotes and try to be transparent about that. So this is all, based on fact and research, but I also just think I tried to write it in a way that brings the emotion through of the story and of this family and of this movement and of this country. And so, even if you're not immediately drawn to this period in history or to Argentina, I would hope that just as a reading experience, you would still be kind of drawn through to the end. And then the other thing I would say is I started working on this book in 2021, and there were parallels that I could draw to today and to home, but they were not nearly as strong as the parallels that can be drawn today. And I do think that this book holds very important lessons that all of us should be paying attention to, about what happens when a government puts its agenda before the rule of law, and also about how ordinary citizens can band together and stand up in the instance that things get really extreme. And so those would be my two arguments for why someone should pick up this book.
Yes to all
I
of
love
that.
that. Agree with everything. Yes.
And thank you so much for, I know we we were going back and forth because we're so bad at checking our email, but I'm so glad that this happened. This has been such a joy.
For doing this. It really has been wonderful for me. And I'm excited to continue listening to the show, and hope that we can all stay in touch. This is really great, and I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you so much. And everyone else listening, if you haven't gotten the book, you can get it wherever books are sold, your library even. Honestly, anywhere, everywhere, look for it immediately, like right now.
Also, the audio version is, so I have not listened to the whole audio version.
It's great. It's great. I actually listened. I went and got more credits on Libro FM, so I could also listen to the audiobook because I read so-so.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, it's narrated by Alejandra Reynoso, who's an amazing voice actress, and
It was so good.
Job. So, yeah, if that's your preferred
I'm
way.
going to need to listen to it, too.
You do need to listen to it, too. Highly recommend it in that way if you're a slow reader like me.
Well, thank you so much, Carmen and Christina. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I hope to stay in touch with both of you.
Yes, thank you.
What a discussion that was.
I feel rejuvenated after talking with it. And I was like, I'm like, at some point I have to stop talking, but I couldn't.
Yeah, and there was so much stuff that we didn't have the time to touch on. Because there's so much in this book. Like Haley said herself, it encompasses like, what, a 60-year
period
time span. And there's so much I didn't know about Argentina, even with the background knowledge that we have from, you know, the podcast. And having knowledge of Azucena Villaflor and what happened to her, of Operation Condor, of the disappeared. But still, there's so much to learn.
Yeah. And even if you listen, like, you know, you listen to that full interview, and yes, we talked about a lot that happens in the book, but even then, this isn't even like touching, like you are missing so much.
There's
if you don't read
so
it.
much.
Read
it. Just go right now. It's a store right now.
Yeah. Order it. Get it somewhere. You must. But yeah. What an amazing story and an amazing person. Everything.
Yeah.
Amazing
I said this about Azucena Villaflor when we did that episode, and I was like, I was truly changed by learning about Azucena and her story, and a part of this book talks about Azucena and what happened to her, but it's like even more because it's all the abuelas. You know, even though it focuses on Rosa, there's still a lot that is talked about the other abuelas and their fighting spirit, and they were just amazing.
They really were, and we could go on and on about them, but we won't.
Right.
Yeah. But we could. No. But yeah, we hope that this was first. We hope that everyone goes and reads this book.
Yeah.
And then also we hope that this was one less historia unknown for you.
Bye.